just a waste of time, the way people are doing it now. And so that's where I felt like I could be most useful. And that's where I started watching code. So that's how Yacht found me. If you go to watchingcode.com, I started teaching with Angular. So you can see I started with Angularjs because that's what I was working on at Google. And then later on, I started with a popular... Actually, won't really need the internet very much at all. Yeah, so I started off teaching AngularJS because that's what I was using at Google. And what I found was that a lot of students were taking my course because it kind of shows you how to build a real, almost like a startup or MVP kind of product. And so a lot of people were coming into the course knowing that that was the result that they wanted to have. But I was starting to see that they were terrible at JavaScript. Especially the people that thought they were good were often the worst. And so that was a big problem. The other problem is a lot of people wanted to take the course, but they didn't feel like they were good at JavaScript. And so I would get this question 10 times a day. How do I learn JavaScript? And I Googled the same way you probably would. I probably Googled how to learn JavaScript, or like best way to learn JavaScript, something like that. And I found a book, I think it was from here, and he says to read Eloquent, maybe he took it out. But there was a book recommended called Eloquent Javascript you may have heard of. And I started researching the book and found that people were really, really confused with it. So I was under the assumption that the book was fine, so I was like, well, I guess I can start off by seeing what people are having trouble with. And so if you search Eloquent JavaScript right now, this is funny to me, but on the front page, near the front page anymore.
It's there.
Oh, it's right here. I clearly don't check this very often, but I wrote a set of notes for the book that got pretty popular. But I think the thing I realized is that the book wasn't the answer. And so throughout that process, I realized that it just wasn't working. And the notes can only do so much. I actually removed that set of notes from the site. You can't access it unless you Google it, because I think it's actually harmful. And so I guess my thinking now is if you Google it, then I guess you can look at it. But if you don't know about it, you don't see it. But that basically, I think, motivated me to put something better out there. Because I just felt like people were reading this book, they're reading other resources, and they're just wasting their time. And I think that's bad. This is just a shout out to Yacht. Read his blog post, reallifeux.net. I'll open it up. It kind of talks about the kind of the more subtle details about watching code. I think it's the next blog post.
Should be the second one, yeah.
The second one. Watching code saved me from coding hell. So check that out. And then I have a bunch of random words that I came up with that I think kind of describe a lot of the struggles that I see every day. One is there's no linear path, jumble of crap. There's like what I call the Grand Canyon of education. A lot of beginner stuff, a lot of advanced stuff, nothing in the middle. No examples of building stuff. A lot of theoretical functions called outer function, inner function, a lot of crap like that. No real projects. Open source is kind of like that. No emphasis on process. How do programmers program? They don't program fake examples all day. This kind of realization, everything's a to-do list. Google search results, Airbnb, Stack Overflow, this to-do list. Everything's a to-do list. Thinking in code. And then a couple things, focus on capabilities instead of knowledge. Never see that any instructor, with any students. They're always asking me, what's a closure? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Worry about what you can make, not what you know. And then the last thing that I really focus on, I think is the most important thing, is independence. The answer is not a library of 100 tutorials. That's why I only have 2 courses. The answer is for you to level up beyond tutorials, so you don't need me anymore. And I'm constantly thinking about how I can make myself useless, how you can think like me so I don't have to handhold you, right? And so I think even for me it was a learning process where when people would ask me about a question in Angular course, I would try to be like, oh man, I need to get customers and just have a really good experience, I'll go find the typo for you, and then perfectly explain what happened. Now when I know, well, there are no errors in the course, like absolutely none. So I know that it's probably your fault, and so I just say, this is probably a typo, you should look at this video, and look at it carefully. And that's not to be an ass, it's so that you learn good habits. If you tap your coworker on the shoulder every time you put typo in your code, you're not gonna last very long. And so I kind of prod you in a friendly way, in a realistic way. I'm not trying to baby you. And so those are some of the things that I learned. And it's kind of the framework, like how I approach teaching, how I've decided to even come up with the code examples for today. It's all based on this kind of thinking in my head. Just teaching you all the way I would want to be taught. And I wouldn't want my instructor to waste 20 minutes looking for a typo that I made. Right? I don't think that's good for the world. It's wasting someone's time. So with that, that's just kind of a lot of philosophy stuff, but I think it's important because I think the way your teacher thinks about these things is very apparent in the quality of their work. In a lot of ways, it's the only thing that matters, because if you don't start from the right principles, you build the wrong products. And that's true for teaching, it's true for engineering, for product management, for design. And it's no different here. Everything's the same. So I want to show you 2 things. There's 2 programming concepts here. One is debugging with Chrome. I'm always shocked by how few people know how to use the debugger. So I guess I'm curious here, like how many people have used the debugger before? Okay, so few. How many people use it regularly? Like none. That's about right. I think this is actually relatively good. I've seen much worse where no one raises their hand. But I'll explain what it is if you don't know what it is. The second thing is 2 buzzwords that annoy the hell out of me because they're really poorly named and they're usually taught with really abstract examples. And so I'm going to try to show you some real examples so that you can understand these 2 things that everyone makes a big deal about, but they're really not that big of a deal. So yeah, does anyone have any questions before I continue? Any comments, anything? Any feelings, or? Okay. Okay, so let's go into the code. Okay. So one thing I really emphasize is use the console. Don't use fake tools. Use real tools. Don't worry about which tool you use, just use the real one. Don't worry about your editor. Don't worry about things that don't matter. And so I'm gonna just really manually type in the console, even though it's kind of annoying. Because this is what I do, even though it's not the most convenient thing. You don't always do the most console. If you've not used, does anyone not know what the console is in Chrome? Okay, so yeah, so basically it's just a place where you can run code. You can run JavaScript right inside of the console in Chrome. There are ways you can get it. You can right-click inspect, and you can go to the console tab. You can also, I think, go to window. I don't actually know how to do it through the menu. Yeah, but the shortcuts are different for every computer, so. Developer tools. There you go. If you want to go through the menu, you can click the right thing at the top and then developer tools. The other thing I'll say is just use Chrome. A lot of people don't use Chrome, and then they have a lot of questions, and then they ask someone that doesn't use anything else, and then they're lost, and that's a really bad way to get lost, because there's no good reason for it. So if you want to use another browser, use it for fun, but when you're programming, use Chrome. So the thing with the debugger is I get a lot of questions. So I have a section in Practical JavaScript. It's called "Don't Wonder About Things the Debugger Can Tell You," and almost every beginner, the classic questions that are asked are, what happens when X is this? Can I do this? Is this gonna have a problem? What's happening in line 4? All those questions you don't need to ask a person. The computer can just tell you. And the thing that's gonna tell you is the debugger. So I'm gonna write a really simple function, and it's gonna be called, what is it gonna be called? Is string in array. Actually typed it, perfect. And so this function it's not very complicated. It takes string in the array. If it is, then return true. And it'll go through and check every item in the array. If it's in there, it'll return true. If it goes through the entire for loop and it doesn't return true, then it must not be in there, so it returns false. So I think for a lot of you, this is probably not, it's a pretty simple function, but the point isn't to have a super complicated function. The point is just to show you how you can see and step through every single part of this code to know exactly what it is. And even if you already know it, I think there could be some details that can come out of this. So one thing you can do is you can just type debugger right here, and then when you run, well actually I'll do it without the debugger first, so you can see how it works. And so we have that function is string in array, and so the first argument is an array and the second item is a string. So I'm just going to have some students in here. So let's say that we have Gordon, Erwin, Rob. These are people I met so far. Jenny. So in this case, it's going to return false because yat's not in here. So it returns false. If we change it and we add yat in there, it'll return true. So that's how the function works. Now if you want to go and step into this and really go through the code line by line the way the computer is going to do it, you can use a debugger. And so now the next time we run this code, it's going to pause right at the debugger line, and you can go through the code every one line at a time, see the value of every variable at every moment in time. And the point of this is for you to understand how the computer works. It's for you to get the intuition to think like the computer. And so then the whole point is, after a while, you don't need to do exercises like this anymore. You can just look at the code and know exactly what's going to happen, right? So that's the kind of the point. The point isn't to do this all the time. It's to do it until you know exactly what it will do, right? So you could actually write, if you were going to draw out what happens, if someone asks you, you could tell them what's happening at every moment in time. That's the goal, full understanding of the code you write. So now if we run the code, or run the function, we're doing the same thing, is string an array, and we have an array of strings, and then we're trying to see if yat is in there. Then it'll pause in the debugger, and it'll go and stop right at that line. And this is really interesting because you can see, like for example, I think a lot of us kind of know what parameters are, but this allows you to actually see, oh, like input array is actually equal to this array that we passed in. Test string is equal to yat. And so you can actually just see all this stuff in minute detail. And you can see the same thing on the right. You can see, I is in this function, but it's not defined at the moment. Like these are the kind of details that really matter. They actually will matter, even though, you might not care that I is not defined at this moment. it's this kind of understanding that you want to get to know what is happening at every single line. And that's how that's how you become independent. So this is the kind of stuff I emphasize, like mastery, not like glossing over stuff. Being honest with yourself about whether you understand things, and also holding your instructors responsible too for explaining these things, right? Don't let someone teach you, but not teach you, right? Don't let someone cover things for you, but not teach you. You should hold them responsible, ask them the hard questions, and that's, just kind of more philosophy stuff. So when you go through this, you can step through each line in the code, and I'll just do that. So you can click this button on the right, step over next function call, and that will go through to the next line. So you moved over. When you're highlighted on a line, that doesn't mean the line has run yet. It means like, imagine almost it's like, you're actually like right here. Right, that code hasn't, the highlighted part has not run. So to go and run that code, you have to click and step over that. So right now, I is still undefined, even though I right here is equal to 0, but this is not run yet. Right, so you'll see that now it's run. So now I is 0. And then you'll notice that this is not, even this looks like one line of code, but it's not. It's not one line of code. And then the next thing you step over is this part, right? So like, this is why you have to use a debugger to actually understand how the code works. Beginners never understand this. They think that a line is a line is a line. But JavaScript doesn't care about spacing, right? You could write this entire line of code in one line, or this entire function in one line. So understanding things like this are actually important to understanding like when to use a semicolon, right? So there are a lot of details around how the code works, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. When you go over to the next thing, you'll notice that this doesn't run. It skipped that. That happens at the end of right? And now we're inside, and now this part will kind of work the way you expect it to. If test string is equal to input array I is 0 at the moment, and but it's not because the first item in the array is Gordon. So if you go through, it's just going to go back up. It's not going to return true. It's going to keep on doing it until it gets to the very, very end. Until I is 4. So I'll stop when I is 3. So here you'll notice I is 3. It's still not going to be true. And after each loop, then it increases I by 1. Now I is going to be 4. And so the last time you go through the loop, this will be true. And you can test that. You can see test string is yat. You can see that's the input array. And you know I is 4, so it's going to compare yat to yat. So it's going to be true. And when you return something, you exit the function. So you're going to skip the rest of the code. And then to just continue, you just resume script execution. And that's why you see true at the bottom. Right, so I think I even chose a simple example to show you that there's a lot of detail that is easy to miss if you don't really understand what's happening. And getting to that understanding is important, especially when you have really hard to track down bugs. If you don't understand the code, actually understand the code, it's very, very hard to debug. And tools like this are really helpful because when you're starting, it's impossible to know this stuff, right? And no one is going to explain it to you. So this is actually a better teacher than most people when you're starting. And that, I think, is a real lifesaver. Like, for me, I didn't learn how to do this for a long time because no one taught me. So I think for maybe the first 6 months or so when I was learning to program, I didn't even know what this was, right? And to mess around with for so long and not know a tool like this is crazy. You should know this within like an hour of starting. Maybe not at the beginning, but very, very soon. The same week for sure. So that is the first thing I wanted to cover. There are a lot of different things you can cover. So, do with the debugger, that's really powerful. So, let me show you an example. So I have this to-do list in my browser right now, and you might be wondering, like, what happens when you add something? And if you look at the code, and you look at how much code there is, it's pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of code. It's hard to tell what part of the code is responsible for adding an item. But if you think about it a little bit more, you know that when each item is added, when you click enter, it's going to add something to the page, right? So if you right-click this and inspect that element, you can see that there's this view div, and you can kind of guess, or this unordered list, and all the items are inside of this unordered list. So then you can do something like this, which is pretty cool. You can add a DOM breakpoint on Subtree modification, which means if anything changes, is added, deleted inside of this unordered list, then run the debugger and pause. And then you can know exactly what code is causing tests to be added. Right, so you can use these tools to, there's just no way you would really be able to do that unless you went through file by file and like tried to read everything. Right, so it's a really big shortcut and something I highly recommend getting familiar with. So that's the first item. Does anyone have any questions about that? And there are other ways to run the debugger too. I talked about the debugger statement and the graphical. I didn't talk about the graphical way, but I talked about the DOM, breaking on DOM changes, and then there are other ways you can say if this event happens, you can pause the code too. But I'm not going to go into all those ways. Are there any questions so far? Yep.
If you're tinkering in the debugger, so for example, you went in, you kind of added in a human terms, a function that was going to be triggered. So if you're tinkering in there, is there any way that you can screw up the source code, or is it separate from actually editing the source code?
It's separate. So you can link it to your source code, but you have to configure it. And it's really annoying, so I doubt that you did it. I've never actually done that, even though I know it's possible, because this seems really annoying. I prefer to edit my files in one place, not from two places. I mean, maybe I'm a caveman in that sense. But there are people that do use the Chrome's editing features, but I find that too complicated for me. Yep.
If you're writing something in the console, can you actually save it so that you can come back to it later?
Those are advanced capabilities I don't really use, but you can sort of. So in the sources, you can have this thing called Snippets. Snippets are like little scripts that you save that you want to reuse later. But aside from that, I don't think that there's much functionality there. I mean, again, like, I basically use it like a beginner uses it, to be honest. I don't use any of the advanced features because it's like overwhelming. There are a lot of buttons, and I've been okay with being a simple user. So it's not something I'd worry about. Get really comfortable with the simple stuff. It's really, really like deep, the stuff it can tell you. And then if you really find that you have a specific thing that is killing you, then you can go, no. But that's like really not required. Yep.
So I didn't understand the function when I used the debugger. Maybe that's why I'm still very confused with those like 4 icons on the source code.
The 4 icons?
Yeah, like post-script execution, step over, step into the next function.
Oh, these buttons at the top. Yeah.
And
so
also, like when I have I use rather than like putting debugger, I put the breakpoint on the source code, but I found myself put in the wrong place, and I'm not debugging right way. It's just always out of the function. I don't get.
Yeah. So that's more advanced stuff. Like knowing where to put the debugger statement or hitting the breakpoint is important. And the key thing is that code has to run. So if it doesn't run, it's not gonna,
Right.
it's paused there, right? So you have to think, that's something you have to think about, right? If the code never runs, it's never gonna trigger the debugger. In terms of the question about the buttons here, the way I think about it is this button with that I'm hovering over now, it just goes to the next line. This one also goes to the next line, but if it's a function, it will go into the function.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Could you say it again?
Yeah, so this button will just always go to the next line.
Right.
But this button, for most intents and purposes, works the same as this, the previous one, but if it's on a function, it will go inside of the function. You'll see that in a moment, actually. Yeah.
So Gordon, for an example, let's say you write this function, for some reason that semicolon was omitted or we forgot about it. Can you omit the semicolon and run debugger, see what happens?
Say that again?
If you omit that semicolon after the 0.
After the 0?
Yeah. Or whatever character and run
Right.
debugger.
So you're trying to replicate a bug.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try it. Oh, it won't even. You probably wouldn't even run the code because you would get an error first. And it's saying line 3. So VM 300:3. It's in here, so it's telling you to look at that line. If you try to run this function, let's see what happens. It's gonna go through here. Oh wait, it's going over the old one. Let's actually try that. So this is another lesson. It's sometimes surprising to people, but I often have no idea what's gonna happen. Like in this case. And a lot of beginners will be like, they'll then ask me, and then I tell them, well, I'm just gonna run it. So why don't you run it? Because you can just see what happens, right? Not to pick on you, Erwin, but I actually don't know what's gonna happen, so I think it's kind of interesting to do this. Okay, so what's happening is because you have an error right here, this function is not getting even registered. But there's a previous function we defined that didn't have an error, so when you run the debugger, it's running the function that doesn't have this typo. Does that make sense? So to fix that is, we would say like Erwin is string an array to make sure it's not grabbing the old function. And then we could, what's gonna happen is it's probably gonna say not defined. Yeah. So because you had an error right here, it's not even gonna make this function for you. It's just gonna say you messed up. So then when you try to run this messed up function, it's just gonna say it doesn't exist. Because you didn't actually create it. Does that make sense? You should try it. You should try it. But what's important here is that when you're looking at these error messages, you can see that it's in line 3. So it's really important. So these line numbers are very helpful, even though they look like gibberish. And with this, it's also really helpful. It's just saying that that function doesn't exist. So one thing you see a lot is people see an error message and then they just continue trying to run the same code over and over again. It's important to understand how to read error messages so that you don't do that, and you actually use that to then guide you to the problem. Okay, cool. Any other questions on this debugger stuff? Yeah, so I think the takeaway here is play with it. Don't even go and try to find the most complicated thing and run the debugger over it. Run it over code that you know well and see if it does exactly what you actually think it does. Because I think that it's actually going to behave slightly differently than you actually think. And the whole point of doing this is so that your idea of how the code works is in sync with what the computer is doing. Like that's key to being a good programmer, that you know what the computer's gonna do when you run your code. And that's the point of this. It's not to like, go understand a crazy, super complicated function. At least not yet. You can use the debugger to do that, but right now it's just to get really comfortable with it and know the basics of what is really happening with everything that you write. So that's Chrome and debugging with Chrome. The next thing I want to talk about is I won't even talk about the terminology right now. I'm just going to show you an example. And do we have is this supposed to be an hour?
2 hours.
2 hours? Okay. I'll try to stop by 11. So I'll show you one example, and it's actually really interesting because it's related to the previous thing that we just did. We want a function that runs the debugger on functions for us. Because when we ran the debugger, we had to redefine the function, stick the debugger statement in there, and that's kind of annoying. This function will just do it for us. So let's take a look at how that will work. So luckily, we already have a function. We have this isStringArray function. Let's fix the typo. So we have this function. Let's pretend that we don't have the debugger statement there. So how would you run the debugger on this without modifying the function? There are a couple ways you could do it. You could have the debugger statement here, and then run the function. So isString and array, and then Erwin, and So is yacht in this array? It's going to be true, but it's going to run the debugger first. So it'll actually pause here, and then it'll run the function. So this works fine. And it pauses in the debugger. So this works, but it's still not awesome. Because we have to remember, you have to know how debugger statements work. What we'd like to have is just a function where you can just stick our function into it. So the experience we want is like this. We want to say, pretend there's a run with debugger function, and I forgot the name of the function, isStringArray. And so we want to just stick isStringArray into here. Have something like that. And then it'll do it for us. So I'm realizing that this is a little bit more complicated example than I would want because it takes arguments. So this is a really good exercise to get this to work on your own. But I'll show you a simplified example that doesn't take arguments. So let's have a function that just say Gordon function that I already made. And what we want is we want to have a run with debugger function. Just take say Gordon and then run the debugger on say Gordon. So before I do that, I'll just show you how say Gordon works, just to be thorough. It just console logs Gordon. And what we want though is we want the debugger to go into this function. So run with debugger doesn't exist yet. So let's try working on that. Run with debugger. And remember, the way we want it to work is we want it to take a function. So we want it to take, say, Gordon. But when you're writing a function parameter, you don't want the parameter name to be so specific. You want it to be like input function. It's like function that you pass in, just a general name. Because people are going to use run with debugger on a lot of different functions. And from here, let's just console log input function to start. And then let's see how that works. So the thing I'm doing right now is I'm prototyping. It's a lot of beginners, they're like, I want this thing at the end, and then they just write a bunch of code, and it's never gonna work, because typos and stuff, or some slight thing that happens that you don't expect. So what I'm doing is I'm doing the dumbest next thing you could possibly do to get towards our goal. So I'm just prototyping. So here I'm just gonna console log and see, hey, when we pass an argument, is it what we expect? Like, is it actually, can we actually access it in the function? So now when we do run with debugger and we pass in, say, Gordon, what do you think is going to happen? Anyone? It's,
Display the function.
yeah, it's going to display the function definition. It's going to print out the function. It's not going to run the function.
Oh, because you're gonna have the points.
Yeah. So, see that, I think that, again, the reason I always do the next dumbest thing is because oftentimes I'm very forgetful and I don't remember like how things work. And so this is not obvious to a lot of people, right? So it's actually useful to be less ambitious with each thing you do. The next thing is, so we're seeing that you can add a function, like you can give a function to run with debugger, and you can just console log the function, just like a string or an array or an object. It's just the same thing. So what you're noticing here is that functions are just like anything else. It's like a array, it's like a string, it's like an object. It just behaves the same way. But the unique thing about functions is that it's kind of useless to print it out. That's not the point of a function. But the key thing that we have here is we know that we have access to the function. And we also know that to run a function, you just add the parentheses. So when you do this, and then you run this code, what do you think is going to happen now?
Definition of the function, and then the next line will be called.
Right. So what's going to happen is the same thing as before. It's going to log the definition of the function. It's going to do this first. But then it's going to take that function that we just logged to the console. It's going to run it. And that's why, that's exactly what you see. So first it printed out the function definition, and then it runs the function, and that's why I see Gordon right here. And you can actually see that yeah, those are the key points. So this part is from this line, and then Gordon is outcome of running that function. Does that make sense? Is anyone unclear? Or is there even any discomfort at this point? Anything that feels like not right? Okay.
What is console.log?
Okay, yes. Good question. So console log just takes anything and just like tries to print it to here. It just like prints. So this is the console. So it tries to like print it to the console.
So you print the body of the definition of the function that we passed there right now in this example.
Yeah, exactly. So when you say console log input function, it's going to try to print the function definition. And that's why you see, so this line is responsible for this.
Right, but then input function got replaced with Gordon.
So that's different. So this line is responsible for this. Because when you run, say Gordon just console logs Gordon. So it's gonna actually log Gordon in the console.
Here in the last where we see console.log, it prints Gordon there as well.
Right here?
Yeah.
That's part of our function definition. Okay, so this is what the function is going to do. Because this is what the definition for the function, how it works, and the name of it and everything. And then this is you'll actually see this more when you run it through the debugger, because that's the whole point of this, is to run it through the debugger. So I think this is actually a really cool example. So the next thing is, so we kind of have we're really, really close. I'm going to get rid of this console log because that's kind of useless. It's just to show you that you can just print a function out. It's just like a variable or anything else. There's nothing special about functions, except that you can run them. And now I'm just going to add a debugger statement. So you already know what that does. You saw that in the previous demo. So now when we run with debugger, and then pass in say Gordon, what do you think is going to happen now?
It's going to do what you did manually before.
Exactly. So what's going to happen is it's going to say, and then it will try to run say Gordon after that. So that's kind of weird, but I think if we print it out, if we just run it, you'll see what I mean. So we're paused in the debugger, right on the first line of the function, and this is the interesting part, I think, and I'll show you. So inside of this function, remember the way we ran this code is that we passed in say Gordon. And here what's interesting is you can see how the input function parameter name maps to the argument you pass in. Right, so a lot of people are, and I think it's confusing too, the difference between a parameter and an argument. Here you can see the relationship. Parameters, like input function, get set to the argument you pass in. We passed in Gordon, right here. And so what's going to happen is the input function parameter will be equal to say Gordon. And so you can actually see that directly right here. It's just right in your face. There's no question about it. And then you can see the same thing right here. Input function is equal to function say Gordon console log Gordon. So what we're seeing here is a function run with debugger is taking another function, and then it runs a debugger statement. And now we have a line that's trying to run input function. But input function, remember, is our parameter name. The actual value is say Gordon. And when you hover over, you can just see that. And now you had a question, which is, what does this button do? The arrow down dot thing. This is going to go into input function, which means it's going to go into say Gordon. That sounds weird, but so look, I'm just going to click on it and you'll see what happens. So expect it to go into say Gordon. And it brings us inside of say Gordon. And then it runs all the code in say Gordon. And then after say it's done with that, it'll go back to the run with debugger function. So if I keep on going, so here's a case when you want to know when you should step into a function or not. You probably don't want to step into console.log because it works fine. You don't really need to know how it works. So in this case, you probably want to step over because you don't want to go into the function definition or console log. And at this point, this is happening in real time. So at this point, Gordon is on the screen because we just ran that one. And then if you keep going now, it'll bring you back to where we were. And you can also see stuff like on the right side, return value is undefined. If you don't have a return value, it's undefined by default. You can see input function is say Gordon. You can see this is window. A lot of people are confused about this. You can always see what this is inside of the debugger. And then we're done. So the whole point here is, I think technically this example is not very complicated, but the concepts here are really powerful. The concept here, functions can take functions. And what the terminology here is that the function that takes a function is called the higher order function. The function that is passed in is called the callback function. And I still hate those terms because it still doesn't tell you what it does. What I like to think about is what higher order functions like run with Debugger do is they enhance the behavior of a given function. So in this case, it's taking your input function, it's enhancing it by running the debugger on it. And then the thing that you pass into, or the thing that you're enhancing is the callback function. So that's it, that's higher order functions. And there are a lot of examples. So if you go to practicaljavascript.net, you can see me do the same thing for set timeout, which is like you make a little alarm clock for each, or add event listener. And then at the end I talk about the buzzwords that I just talked about. And the one I just went through was run with debugger. So I think I go through it a little bit faster in the course because I assume that you did all the course up till now. But if you want to go back, if anything was confusing, you could go watch these videos. Okay. Yeah, and I guess the point is that the reason this concept is important is you use it all the time in JavaScript, like all the time. And so it's a concept that's very important. Like one example is when you click on a button, you probably want to do something. The way you define like what you want to do is you write a function. So you basically, the English is when you click this button, run this function, right? So what's happening in reality is you have this thing, you have like, let's say that you have a button and then you use this method called add event listener. And what you want to do is you want to say when this button is clicked, so you say what kind of event you want to listen for. When it's clicked, then run some function. And this is the same idea that we went through. This is a function that's taking a function. And responding to a click happens on every application, right? So understanding this concept is really important. And that's what I wanted to make sure that it's pretty clear. And to really make sure it's clear, you should go and watch the videos. And if it's really unclear, you can even ask me. So I think that's everything I wanted to cover. Does anyone have any questions on any of the stuff that I just went through?
Yeah, so how do you run the function, run the debugger with passing parameter?
Yeah. So what I say is that's a really good exercise for you to do on your own. The key thing, it's a little bit too technical for right now, but so every function has access to the arguments that are passed into it. So what I would do, and this is a really good exercise because you have to think about programming design as well. So if you have something like run with debugger, and you have a function that you want to run, say that it is string in array, and remember isString in array takes arguments, right? So what you could do is you could say, just take any number of arguments, and you could handle it that way. You could write a function that does that perfectly and passes these three things into here. You could do that. You could also have an array of arguments, and then you could, so here you would have an array, the first argument is an array, and the second argument is a string. You could do it like that too. But the key thing you have to account for is you have to Google how to access arguments in a function.
So you actually have to modify two functions. The first one is the run debugger, right? Debugger.
Yeah. So here's the pseudocode for it. Let me make sure I have that. So you could say, like, let's say that I want to take a parameter, an argument of arrays, that is the parameters to pass in to this input function. So I could say array, or I don't know, array of parameters. And then what you want to do is Google how to access function arguments, and that will give you access to array of parameters. And then when you run input function, you can pass in array of parameters, right? That's the general idea. So it's a really good exercise.
Is there arguments property on each function that you can get the arguments from?
Yeah, you should Google it, because I don't remember. So I would do the same thing. Just kidding. But this is the idea.
I don't think you would pass the array because when you call the input function, you're passing in those arguments into another function, like say with Gordon.
Right. You have to take them outside of the array, but those are details. That's the high level strategy. You should try it. You can try it right now because it's 2 hours, and then I can go look at your solution. Well, any other questions? And also, if there's like more detailed stuff you want to ask me, I'll be around, so I can come to you individually and help out too.
Yeah, so we have the room till like 12 o'clock, so I guess we can just hang out and Gordon can probably help you with your project or answer any questions.
Great. Yeah, and if you want to do the exercise that you guys just brought up, that would be really good. It would make a lot of sense given the things we talked about. And I think you'll learn a lot about functions if you do that. And that would be a really cool thing to save in your snippets. Then you would always have access to run with Debugger inside of your console at all times, and then you can always run it. So it's actually pretty useful. It's not like a fake weird example.
So when is Slack up and running?
What?
Slack, when is it available?
Oh, okay. Yes. So Erwin is asking about. So the courses I have now for Watching Code are free, but I'm testing out a membership right now where you can. Yeah, it's in it. Where you can like hang out, talk about code. You get a lot of like extra stuff. So if you want to try that out, it's invite only, but right now, so it's like you can't find it on the site. So you have to go directly to this URL. If you're interested, you're all welcome to join that. So yeah, everyone, you can join it now. Yeah, so right now it's just $9 a month. Since it's brand new, I'm just trying to make it a no-brainer for people like that I really want to have, and then you'll just be grandfathered in for life. So check it out. And so that is, I guess I'll leave this URL up because you kind of have to memorize it. So there's that URL, and the other one is, I guess just watchingcode.com is the easiest. From there you can access Practical JavaScript, and yeah, so it's right here. So if you want to check those out. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, and yeah, I'll just be hanging out, answering questions. You can tell me if this is confusing or whatever. So thank you so much. So people break up into groups and stuff, or just hang out?
So usually it's a lot smaller groups. You know, most of the time we don't even have speaking like this. But what I'm thinking is maybe we could just hang out and just talk to people and stuff.
Okay.
But
Cool.
did a great job.
Yeah, thanks. Hey.
It was a nice talk.
Oh yeah, thanks. What's your name?
I'm Jayanti. Nice to meet you.
Wait, what?
Jayanti.
Jayanti?
Nice to meet you. Well, I had a doubt, and it's not regarding what you spoke on the talk. then I've been working on a web application in JavaScript based. So I'm trying to connect to a backend server using WebSockets. So I was wondering if there's any alternative to WebSockets wherein I can talk to the client on a TCP connection rather than HTTP. Is there any way to open a raw socket?
What's the goal? Why do you want to use WebSockets at all?
Talk to the backend server, get the latest website updates from the server, and then display it on the screen.
But why do you want to use WebSockets versus HTTP?
The WebSocket is going to talk to the backend. It's Python-based application, so you have like 3 levels of communication. So at the backend, I want to talk to the web server.
But HTTP can talk to web server too. So why do you want to use WebSockets?
Isn't that the way to open the connection to the web server and talk, or is there any alternative?
I don't really yet understand. So to me, what WebSockets are useful for is having a real-time persistent connection to a client.
Okay.
If you don't have a need to do that,
Okay.
you don't
I
need to.
do have to have a real-time connection because I'm getting something from the backend server and continuously displaying it.
And what?
And continuously displaying it on the screen.
And you
So
don't
I
want
do-
people to have to refresh.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's gonna display. It's more like a Twitter feed. You just get all the real-time
I see.
updates from the
So
backend.
real time is your requirement.
Yes.
You could use something like Firebase that handles it for you.
What is it called?
Okay.
Okay, sure.
It's a real-time database, so it will do it too.
Okay, so you can just
You should look at it. Take a look. Yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot of features, but the thing you're interested in is the real-time database. Yeah. Yeah, I think it will save you a lot of time.
Inside this function, you can get it with the arguments. So here, so inside every function, there's this property called arguments. When you call run with debugger, but you want the other functions. You want the you want input functions. So because you yeah, so like when you go to
What's your name?
CY.
CY, and nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Actually, kind of with a lot of your background, so I really like it. My question pertains more to products. So I'm currently doing like data science stuff, but I'm like exploring the possibility of going into product management and just want to see what are your thoughts on, the flow of coding and like, or what level do I need to do that?
Yeah. It's not being able to program is absolutely not a requirement. And that's like it's one of those things that yeah, I can't really give you a direct answer for just because it's one of those helpful things. And there are a lot of great programmers that can program, a lot that can. So there are no like rules.
Being able to communicate with the
It makes your life easier. For sure. So, but I mean, I think if you break down the skills of a product owner, number one is knowing what to build. Right? Like if you don't know what to build in your program, it's irrelevant. Right? So I think that's actually the key thing. You have to always and with that is like how it goes against other competitors, like all these two things, knowing like what features to build at what time, right? Because you have sparse resources, you can only build one feature, you decide which one is it that you build. Creating, designing features for you, that's the core of the product. And if you don't have that, you might as well just right? So like, I would say focus on those things first. Have like a base comfort level with those things. Luckily, by creating projects from scratch, you can practice those things, right? So it's not like you work on product skills and development skills separately, right? They're actually the same, and they're very related. So one thing that you could do is build a product, program it yourself, and get users to it, right? Try to grow it, and then you can see both the skills. And then when you go interview positions, you're going to be one of the few people that actually has the both experience. So you can talk about these real experiences. That's actually what I did.
That's all you want, right?
And you just work on it. Because you can read books that you want. It's different to
usually means there than that.
right? It's different to have content.
But it is, it's gonna be cool.
Hey, that's good. What's your name?
Yes.
It's recorded.
Yeah, so what you're saying that you do it that way, it's normal.
Yeah.
First, can't you just set like a variable?
No. Yeah, the closest thing is in the membership. So I'm on there all the time. See the Slack. So you can message me on there. But I think the more important thing is that there's all these people that really help, all doing the same thing. So they can help you with stuff, I don't do stuff. But I don't deal with people. I think with the group, I don't do well. See, and the other thing is, if you start from Untitled JavaScript, there's no support. So the stuff I talk about today is like pretty far into the course, right? So if you start from the beginning, I think all this stuff will be very, very clear to you. I didn't want to start from the beginning though, because most people haven't started. They're not starting from zero. So. Did you learn anything today? What did anything stand out?
You have access to oh, Python. Oh. Yeah, plug that in as like a listener.
basics, and I showed that thing where you can trigger the debugger on machine models and stuff. So there are a lot more things. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just one thing at a time. The Chrome developer tools documentation is the most thorough, but it's not the friendliest. But if you want, yeah, it's the best of what exists. Yeah, so unfortunately, that's how I learned. Yeah, great to meet you. Thanks. What's your name? What do you think of the talk?
Basically, it gives you like, usually it's like even though like
Thanks for coming. Oh, awesome. No. Yeah. I'm not sure yet. Yeah. It's great to meet you. Thanks for coming. Oh, what did you think about stuff?
no, yeah, I understand what you're doing, but that's why I was confused.
My brother who's studying computer engineering for like 3 years,
Yeah.
like it, so I think the challenge is understanding what I think the challenge is finding like a teacher who actually can get you somewhere useful. Like I think what you're saying in the beginning is like I've got this and like okay, well that's what an array variable means. Like and like it doesn't when you go through chapters like 1, 2, 3, and you feel like I can do anything with all this knowledge I've been learning. So it's like most 3 or 4 and I went through that. I was like, oh, really? I like how you set everything up. So you start with code, and then you went to functions, and then you use code. And I guess eventually you start making a autonomous path. You like build up into it. It's really cool.
No, that's
Yeah, it's a good. It's